Welcome to the debate. Imagine spending tens of millions of dollars to upgrade your company's software.
Oh, yeah. Buying enterprise AI licenses for literally every single employee.
Right, only to discover that your most brilliant people are, well, actually performing worse. And they're taking just as long to do their jobs.
It is so counterintuitive, but it's the bizarre reality of the generative AI boom right now.
Exactly. We have institutions like McKinsey estimating the potential annual value creation from GenAI to be somewhere between $2.6 trillion and $4.4 trillion across global business functions.
Which is just an astronomical figure.
It is, but then, when you step out of those theoretical projections and look at the actual economic data, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, totally flat.
Right. U.S. non-farm productivity growth has remained essentially flat. It historically averages just 2.1%, and in the first quarter of 2025, we saw a staggering drop to a mere 0.3% increase.
So the disconnect between the capital expenditure and the actual economic output is just massive. We are pouring billions into these foundation models, embedding them in every enterprise suite imaginable, and yet the macroeconomic speedometer is barely twitching.
Which brings us to the core tension we are exploring today, drawing on Jonathan Westover's recent analysis of AI value creation. Why are these promised generative AI productivity gains so elusive? And, how can organizations actually capture this technology's value?
It is the trillion-dollar question.
Literally. So I am taking the position that GenAI's failure to produce gains is fundamentally a structural issue. Capturing true productivity requires comprehensive, top-down organizational process redesign, rather than just simply distributing tools to individuals.
And I will argue that focusing on macro-level process redesign actually obscures the true bottleneck. The friction lies at the granular, individual knowledge worker level, which requires bottom-up innovation and precise task matching to protect our human cognitive capability.
Okay, so to begin, we really have to look at the dominant narrative in the enterprise software market, what I call the individual productivity paradigm.
Ah, the vendor promise.
Exactly. This is the assumption pushed constantly by vendors, right? If you give a knowledge worker a tool like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot, they will just automatically become more efficient.
Right, they'll draft emails in seconds.
Synthesize market research in minutes, and the company will just magically reap the rewards. But the academic research shows this is a deeply flawed premise. Look at the work of Paranam and Revendran on what they call scaling friction.
That's a great concept.
It really is. And if you are listening to this, you've probably lived this exact scenario in your office. You use GenAI to draft a complex strategic memo in like 5 minutes. You feel incredibly productive.
But then reality hits.
Right. Because that memo was generated by an AI, your legal team now has to spend 3 days verifying every single claim to ensure the model didn't, hallucinate a critical piece of data.
Or your cross-functional partners have to spend hours coordinating and fact-checking the output.
Exactly. So at the granular level, sure, you save time. But at the team level, that time was entirely consumed by coordination costs and measurement attribution challenges. You only transform apparent productivity into realized productivity by completely reimagining the end-to-end workflow, tearing down the isolated silos.
I come at it from a different way. That top-down workflow redesign approach, it completely misunderstands the inherent complexity of modern knowledge work.
How so?
Well, knowledge work is not a predictable assembly line where you can just, optimize the conveyor belt. If we look at Dil Aqua's empirical study on what they term the jagged technological frontier, we get a much clearer picture of why just handing out licenses is failing.
The uneven capability profile of the models.
Precisely. GenAI has a highly uneven capability profile. Because of how large language models are architected, they are fundamentally just pattern-matching engines predicting the next most likely word. They can perform incredibly sophisticated tasks, like synthesizing a 100-page legal brief absolutely flawlessly.
Right.
But then, you ask them to perform a seemingly simple spatial reasoning task, and they fail spectacularly. And that border between AI competence and incompetence is invisible.
It shifts constantly.
It does. The Delacroix study showed that when workers accidentally step over that jagged frontier and use AI for tasks outside its true competence, their performance actually degrades significantly. Management cannot map an invisible, constantly shifting, jagged frontier from a boardroom. So the true solution isn't heavy-handed structural redesign, but federated, bottom-up innovation driven by worker agency, where the individual worker dictates the task matching.
But wait, if we acknowledge that workers are stumbling over this jagged frontier and degrading their own performance, we are admitting there is a systemic failure in how the technology is deployed in the first place.
I wouldn't call it a systemic failure, just a learning curve.
But it's costing companies millions. To understand how to fix the workflow, we first need to isolate exactly where the saved time is disappearing in these organizations. You mentioned performance degrading. I point directly to what the industry is calling workslop, the degradation of quality and the ensuing process slop.
Process slop being the bureaucracy created to manage the AI output.
Exactly that. Take the Herman Miller example from the source material. They are a premium design firm, right? And they encourage their industrial designers to use GenAI for ideation.
Yeah, the concept generation phase.
Right. So the designers started producing concepts incredibly fast. They were generating dozens of visual renders in the time it used to take to sketch one. But when leadership reviewed these client presentations, they realized a major problem. The renders were visually stunning, completely polished, but conceptually hollow.
Yeah.
They lacked strategic rationale. They didn't account for structural integrity or manufacturing realities. The client saw the glossy finish, but immediately asked for the actual substance beneath the design.
Which is a perfect example of stepping over the jagged frontier. The AI was good at aesthetic rendering, but incompetent at structural engineering.
Precisely. So to prevent this workslop from reaching the client, the organization had to implement mandatory review protocols. Designers were now required to formally articulate and document the strategic and structural rationale behind every single AI-generated concept before it could advance.
So they added more paperwork.
Yes, because they had to. The time saved upstream by the generative AI was entirely absorbed by the new mandatory review downstream. It is sort of like giving a factory worker a turbocharged stamping machine on an assembly line that lacks a quality control department.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The raw output skyrockets, but the downstream system breaks under the weight of defective parts. Unless you have centralized, structured workflow redesign to catch, route, and refine AI output, the friction destroys all the potential gains.
But see, that assumes the primary issue is just a lack of quality control. Adding organizational review protocols, more top-down overhead, is treating a symptom while completely ignoring the disease.
I wouldn't call quality control a symptom.
But the real danger isn't a lack of structural process, it is the degradation of individual human capability. The friction is happening inside the worker's head. Let's look at the Accenture case study.
Oh, the consulting one.
Yeah. Their consultants began offloading early-stage client analysis to generative AI. The AI scraped the data, identified the trends, and generated the briefing documents. And the outputs were actually fine. They passed the review protocols. But subsequently, those exact same consultants lost their ability to do real-time strategic thinking in live client workshops.
Well, because they hadn't done the foundational analytical work themselves. They outsourced the mental struggle.
Yes, they suffered severe cognitive skill atrophy. Building deep expertise requires mental reps. When you wrestle with raw data, you build a complex mental model of the client's problem. By offloading the heavy lifting to the AI, the consultants lacked the deep context required to pivot when a client pushed back in a meeting.
Right, Ethan and Lilock Malek's research.
Exactly. They refer to this phenomenon as the productivity illusion. The friction isn't that Accenture lacked a review protocol to catch bad work. It's that the human being is losing the deep context required to perform complex reasoning independently. When you impose rigid top-down processes, you inevitably introduce measurement-induced anxiety.
Measurement anxiety?
Yeah, workers feel pressured to show high AI utilization rates to management, so they offload their thinking to hit utilization metrics, their cognitive skills atrophy, and the actual long-term value of their work plummets.
But that cognitive atrophy you were describing at Accenture actually proves my point about structural failure. The failure wasn't just that the consultants lost their edge, it was that the organization's workflow implicitly encouraged them to substitute AI for human reasoning in the absolute wrong phase of the project lifecycle.
It's not about the workflow, it's about the tool misapplication.
But if handing out tools degrades quality and cognition, we have to rethink the entire framework for integration. This leads to the necessity of complete structural decomposition. You cannot just bolt AI onto an existing process or leave it up to the individual to figure out.
Structural decomposition sounds great in a textbook, but you cannot freeze a multinational organization in place for 6 months to redesign every workflow from scratch.
You have to if you want realized gains. Decomposition means tearing the process down to the studs. You don't ask, how can AI help Dave do step 3 faster? You ask, does step 3 even need to exist anymore?
Okay, but
Look at Klarna's customer service transformation. They didn't just give their thousands of service reps a shiny new chatbot to help them type faster. They fundamentally redesigned the entire workflow ecosystem.
I know they had massive time savings there.
Huge! They mapped out what the AI could resolve fully on its own versus what required a human-in-the-loop collaboration versus what needed immediate, friction-free escalation to a human specialist. By decomposing and rebuilding that end-to-end structure, they didn't just shave minutes, they saved an average of 2.5 hours per resolution.
Right, but
Or consider Thomson Reuters. They structurally linked their legal research division with their global news workflows. They created unified AI capabilities that identified legal developments and automatically alerted news teams with context. That kind of cross-functional integration, breaking down historical organizational silos to create entirely new value, can only happen via centralized, structural redesign.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The Klarna and Thomson Reuters examples are elegant, sure, but they represent static solutions for highly dynamic technology.
Static? They're highly integrated.
But generative AI evolves far too fast for rigid, top-down workflow redesigns to keep up. By the time a centralized committee maps out an end-to-end process, decomposing it to the studs, as you say, the underlying model's capabilities have already shifted. The jagged frontier has moved, and your rigid workflow is now obsolete.
Not if the foundation is solid.
This is why federated innovation is the only sustainable framework. Look at how Maersk handled this. The global logistics giant explicitly avoided having headquarters dictate an end-to-end AI workflow.
Well, they didn't dictate the workflow, but they did set strict central guardrails. It wasn't just chaos.
Central leadership provided guardrails for data security, compliance, and privacy, certainly, but they let the regional operational teams build what they actually needed. The Asian teams built port congestion predictors because that was their localized, specific operational bottleneck.
Right.
The European teams built complex customs documentation automation to handle their specific regional regulatory maze. If leadership had mandated a single global supply chain process redesign, they would have built a generic tool that missed the nuance of local operations. Unilever utilized the exact same federated philosophy.
The factory floor example.
Exactly. They invited frontline manufacturing workers, the people physically standing on the factory floor, to identify pain points organically. Those workers engineered AI solutions for predicting equipment failures and optimizing shift schedules that central leadership never would have conceptualized from a boardroom. You have to let the people who do the work define how the AI augments the work.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on those federated successes. Even in the Maersk and Unilever examples, that bottom-up innovation only translated into actual enterprise value because there was a central organizational structure ready to evaluate, integrate, and scale those ideas.
Well,
If an Asian team builds a great port predictor, it only boosts macro productivity if a centralized system deploys it globally where applicable. And that brings us to the ultimate litmus test. If we are going to determine whether top-down process engineering or bottom-up federated innovation is actually working, we have to look at how we measure success. This requires controlled implementation experiments and what I strongly advocate for, total cost accounting.
wait, are we talking about total cost accounting in the sense of tracking API calls and computing power?
Tracking absolutely everything that goes into the workflow, token costs, API fees, licensing seats, and crucially, human verification time.
Ah,
The Boston Consulting Group conducted a brilliant matched pair experiment that perfectly illustrates why measurement must be structural. They took highly similar project teams, gave one group access to GPT-4, and withheld it from the control group.
I know this study.
Right. So at the granular task level, the AI-enabled group saves significant time on initial research, synthesis, and drafting slide decks. But here is the critical revelation. The total project timeline didn't shrink by a single day.
Because they reinvested the time into the work.
They expanded the work. It is a textbook demonstration of Parkinson's law. Work expands to fill the time allotted for its completion. The consultants used the time saved by the AI to generate more alternative hypotheses, which then required more data validation, which led to longer client communications.
Which is better for the client.
But at a micro level, they were faster. At the macro level, the structural timeline was identical. If you do not have rigorous total cost accounting and end-to-end measurement, executives will declare victory based on task-level speed. They will say, look, drafting takes 30% less time, while the organization itself doesn't move 1 inch faster or save a single dollar on the balance sheet.
Let's pause on that. Because your reading of the BCG experiment assumes that completing a consulting project faster is the only valid metric of success.
It's a primary metric of productivity.
I argue that the BCG experiment proves the exact opposite. It proves we should stop measuring generic, time-based productivity entirely. Granular productivity tracking, trying to account for every minute saved drafting versus every minute spent verifying, is profoundly counterproductive.
How else do you measure ROI?
It is like micromanaging a jazz band. If you obsessively measure exactly how many notes each musician plays per minute, you are technically capturing data, but you are completely destroying the harmony. Kellogg and colleagues have documented extensively how algorithmic, granular productivity measurement reduces worker autonomy.
I'm not suggesting micromanaging individuals.
But when workers know they are being tracked for speed, they engage in strategic behavior that undermines genuine high-quality work. If you obsess over total cost accounting, you lose the forest for the trees.
But if we don't rigorously measure time and cost across the workflow, how on earth do organizations justify multi-million-dollar investments in enterprise AI? You cannot just tell the board, we bought the licenses and the harmony is great.
You justify it by shifting to value-focused metrics instead of time-focused metrics. Look at the Cleveland Clinic's integration of generative AI.
The healthcare example.
Yes. They didn't approach the technology by asking, how many minutes can we shave off a doctor's charting time so they can see 3 more patients a day? That is the industrial assembly line mindset you were talking about earlier. Instead, they empowered their frontline clinical staff to design the integration.
Right.
And those clinicians focused on using AI to identify hidden gaps in patient care history. The AI synthesized the massive medical records before the appointment. So when the doctor walked into the room, they weren't staring at a screen typing. They were looking the patient in the eye.
Which improves the experience, certainly.
Exactly. The value wasn't in doing the exact same diagnostic work 20% faster. It was in allowing the AI to handle the routine data synthesis so the human could elevate the quality of the diagnostic outcome. When you measure value higher patient satisfaction scores, measurable reduction in care gaps, improved physician retention due to less burnout, you realize that bottom-up task matching creates profound impact. The total project timeline of an appointment remained the same, but the value generated skyrocketed.
I hear you, but I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, purely because it creates an incredibly convenient excuse for the stagnation we are seeing in the macroeconomic data.
An excuse?
Yes, it is very easy for an executive to say, well, the AI didn't actually make our operations any faster, and our costs haven't decreased, but the work is subtly better in a qualitative way that is hard to measure. That ambiguity is exactly how organizations waste billions of dollars on hype.
I wouldn't call patient outcomes hype.
No, but in a broader corporate context, if we want to realize generative AI's trillion-dollar potential, we must treat it as a systemic, structural challenge. That means rigorous workflow redesign to eliminate coordination friction. It also means segmented, context-embedded training. Take Bosch, the global engineering firm.
They had a very structured rollout, true.
They did. They didn't just hand out licenses and tell their staff to organically find value. They engineered the adoption. They built highly specific role-based modules. The procurement teams were trained specifically on how AI could execute contract analysis within their workflow. The manufacturing teams were trained on predictive maintenance protocols.
Right.
They mapped the AI directly to the organizational structure, and as a result, they achieved sustained adoption rates exceeding 60%, vastly outperforming generic bottom-up deployment. You have to engineer the integration from the top down.
That entirely assumes the organization's top brass knows exactly what the AI will be capable of next month, which, let's be honest, they don't. Generative AI is fundamentally a human-centric augmentation. Its true value relies entirely on respecting that jagged technological frontier. But it relies on protecting human cognitive skills from atrophy by ensuring workers are doing the heavy lifting where it counts. And it relies on empowering those frontline workers who understand the deep, subtle nuances of their specific domains. If you try to over-engineer this integration from the top down, you'll end up with brittle, bureaucratic processes that snap the moment the AI hallucinates or the moment a new model update drops that changes the frontier entirely.
Well, we have covered immense ground today, moving from macroeconomic stagnation all the way down to the psychology of the individual knowledge worker. If there is one point of convergence we share, it is that the vendor-driven individual productivity narrative, the pervasive myth that you can just buy AI licenses, hand them to employees, and watch productivity soar, is completely dead.
Dead on arrival.
It leads inevitably to disappointment, process slop, and cognitive atrophy.
Absolutely. Handing out tools and hoping for the best is not a strategy. On that, the empirical evidence is incredibly clear.
Where we remain in respectful disagreement is the remedy required to unlock that value. I maintain that to turn apparent, localized productivity into realized organizational productivity, processes must be engineered and radically re-engineered from the top down. We have to tear down silos and cut across boundaries to eliminate scaling friction.
And I maintain that true sustainable transformation must be nurtured from the bottom up. We need federated ecosystems that respect the autonomy of the worker, recognizing the immense complexities of matching an evolving AI to specific, ever-changing tasks without destroying the human capability in the process.
This generative AI era is still in its absolute infancy. The massive gap between the promised trillions in value and the stagnant 0.3% productivity growth we are seeing today is the exact space where organizations will either thrive or waste vast amounts of capital over the next decade.
Without a doubt.
We encourage you to explore the source frameworks on value creation we've discussed today and decide for yourself where the true path to transformation lies. Because right now, the trillion-dollar question remains, how do we actually capture the value of the most powerful technology of our generation? Thank you for joining us.